Good afternoon, everybody. Hi. Welcome to Lunchtime CLE. We have with us today Noelle Vollen. She is the Trafficking Policy Coordinator and Staff Attorney at MNPASA, the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Noelle coordinates the Minnesota Statewide Safe Harbor Protocol Implementation Project and is a subject matter expert and national speaker on the issues of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. Sorry, it seems loud. Noelle is a graduate of Hamlin Law School. She is a member of the State Bar of Minnesota, and she's a member of the Minnesota Statewide Human Trafficking Task Force Steering Committee and Policy Subcommittee. Please help me welcome Noelle.
Thanks, Liz, and thank you all for taking the time I don't even see very many people eating lunch, but I appreciate you taking the time. Just to kind of get a show of hands, who in the audience is a law clerk today? Okay, excellent. Who else do we have represented here today? Just so I make sure that I'm speaking directly to the audience. You can feel free and shout it out. Awesome. Yeah. Well, yes, somebody in the room very aptly stated a room full of attorneys. Yes. Excellent. So just to kind of give you a little bit more background, the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. How many of you are familiar with our organization? Some of you. Okay. So we represent in the state all the sexual assault advocacy organizations. We do policy work that further our goals as sexual assault advocates. We also do technical assistance and training on a state and national level. Our primary areas of focus through our Sexual Violence Justice Institute is multidisciplinary collaboration and teamwork and developing protocol, which I'll get into today. So basically what we're doing is talking about how do we get the different systems that touch sexual violence to kind of come together, coordinate in a way that is helpful to a victim and produces good outcomes for the victim. So also another just side note, I come from direct services. I've worked directly with victims of trafficking and women and youth coming out of prostitution. So you will hear a lot of the advocacy side of me coming out. I was a fresh, brand new attorney at an agency that served a very vulnerable population, the only attorney, the first attorney, so it was nerve-wracking and baptism of fire. But I think there's a lot of people out there doing some great work, and you all are in a position to also make the system better for victims of sexual violence and victims of sexual exploitation. And we'll talk a little bit more. In fact, here's a roadmap about what sexual exploitation is and what sex trafficking is and why I'm treating them as two different things, but we're speaking about them in the same sentence. So a little bit of what we are going to be doing today, and it's really, I'm trying to stay in front of the mic so everybody can hear, but also look at what I'm speaking on. We're going to cover some definitions, and the point of these definitions isn't oh, you guys don't know what we're talking about when we say sex trafficking or sexual exploitation. It's just to give you some additional language as attorneys who communicate with all sorts of people in your professional and personal capacities, help you articulate what sex trafficking is in this state and also what we mean by sexual exploitation and how we're handling that as a state. And by how we're handling that, I really do want to go over some of the underlying values and philosophy of our statewide approach because it is pretty unique. Minnesota is very progressive, and we, to give you a preview, have taken the approach of public health versus public safety. Yes, public safety is a component, but that framework of public health puts a different spin on it, more holistic spin. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then finally, we want to talk about developing the local response, and this is fantastic that we've got you all here in the room, and also all the participants who are joining via webinar. We want to be talking to folks about the local response because this isn't a metro problem. And it's not just that it's not a metro problem. Yes, we acknowledge it's happening in all parts of Minnesota. I'm saying,
I just wanted to let you know that we could see that.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. But we also wanted to talk about how this is happening in different parts of the state. Because a lot of times, when we start talking about sex trafficking, we see these images on the screen. So I know this is your lunch break, you're probably just looking to listen and absorb, but if I can get some volunteers to just tell me at a glance your first impressions of these images on the screen. What are you seeing here? And you can feel free to yell it out.
A lot of women.
A lot of women. Good observation. What else are we saying?
Hands.
I'm sorry?
Hands.
Hands. Yes, specifically what kind of hands? All right.
Hands touching people, right?
Hands touching people, right? So there's some visible signs of somebody using their hands aggressively, also bound hands, right? Anything else in particular about the victims that you're noticing, little patterns or trends?
A lot of them look like women of color.
Oh, that's interesting. So noted that a lot of them look like women of color, and that's actually the first time I've heard that. Normally people say that they look like most of the victims are portrayed as white. And that's kind of the point that we're reading the slide here, is that the stories that we are telling in our trainings, in the way we talk about trafficking, and yes, the way they play out in cases, and there's we'll get into that a little bit later, but what we are hearing over and over again is that there's a victim who's very visibly a victim, who very visibly wants your help. There's that bondage, there's that for sale aspect, and that's what folks consciously or unconsciously are looking for when they hear stories of trafficking. Now, does that mean that happens every time? No, and our state has made accommodations for that in the way we wrote our statute, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But the point is if you hear that doesn't happen here, particularly in your communities, and this is what people are envisioning that this is, right? That this kind of sex trafficking doesn't happen here, they're probably right. It doesn't happen this way. And so let me give you kind of an example of things that are happening. I'll tell you a story that I recently heard from somebody that we provided technical assistance to, who is an investigator in one of the correctional facilities. She had an inmate make some calls, and you can make calls, but they are going to be recorded. This particular inmate was calling lifelinks. I'm not going to do a survey of the room about who knows what lifelinks is. I will just tell you and assume that nobody does know. It's basically a hookup call site. You call the number and you can hook up with folks, and all sorts of transactions can happen. So this particular inmate was scrolling through the options, scroll, pass, until he found somebody that said, yeah, I'm just doing this because I need a little money on the side. Okay, so immediately he knows that this person needs something. Calls her up, they start having a conversation. He finds out that she used to be engaged in prostitution. In fact, she was had been pimped out and very violently beaten, and finally come out of that and was entering into services. But for those of you who know full well, if you've worked directly with clients, you're just seeing the unintended consequences that happen when you have a criminal record. It was very obvious that she needed that additional finances because she had a criminal record, couldn't get a job, couldn't get good housing, and sometimes once you've been broken down, where that sort of thing has happened to you, it's very easy to get sucked back in. And so he was listening, information gathering, and started up this relationship with her, which only took a matter of days. So this information gathering happened, and he was able to hear that, yes, she'd been in prostitution, so he knows already that she has crossed that line. He knew that she had been beaten, and so he knew the angle to take. And so he confessed to her that, yes, he was a pimp previously, and that he did indeed violently deal with some of his girls violently, but he's reformed now. And so they were going to start a relationship together once he got out. And so he started talking to her about her prior involvement in prostitution. It was saying, yeah, but this provided you with money. You did enjoy it, right? Well, no, I didn't like it at all. And that is something that you will consistently hear from individuals who are in prostitution. No, they do not enjoy it. There's an aspect that they enjoy, and that is the ability to get money. That's wholly different from actually enjoying the act. And so he kind of reframed it for her and said, yes, but this presented you with a lot of opportunity, didn't it? So he's very savvy doing the kind of fishing, doing the information gathering, doing this sort of pushing the boundaries and see how far he can go. And once he realized that he could convince her to engage in prostitution for him, he then sent his sister over, who worked for him in his operation, and his sister would then be collecting the money on his behalf. And this woman was working for him because she felt like, well, I finally have somebody who is, you know, caring about me, right, and showing some sort of concern for her well-being, and reframing this issue so she doesn't have to feel bad about getting back in despite her circumstances. Now, this is not your typical, this doesn't look like this situation, right? Because in our minds, we're saying, he's doing it from inside. So there is no forced fraud or coercion. She consented to this. She's done it before. She knew what she was getting into. But let me be clear. This is not something that we can just dismiss, because our laws have said it doesn't matter if you've consented. It doesn't matter if you've had prior engagement in prostitution. If somebody else is profiting off of that prostitution, they are trafficking. And so there's different ways. Again, there's different ways this is happening. Sometimes we are seeing sexual exploitation and trafficking happening in high schools. We've heard a lot of reports from some of our out-of-state service providers where high school boyfriends are selling essentially their girlfriends for access to parties, for drugs, and selling to other high school students. So now you've got perpetrators, both the buyers and the sellers, and the victims are all youth. Right? So that is not your typical sex trafficking case where you've got a victim who's clearly innocent, means rescuing, is cooperating with law enforcement because the law enforcement rescued them. We have to acknowledge this piece. A lot of the cases that we're seeing, and a lot of the cases that we're seeing used in trainings have to do with a pimp of color, right, or a person of color is in the pimp or trafficking role. And let me be clear, this was actually perfectly summed up by a colleague who's also a survivor, who said, well, yeah, they're catching the black pimps because they're looking on Backpage. And if you look on other websites, you will find the white pimps. And so we have to just be very careful about our narratives, one, so that people understand the types of victims and how they will manifest. They will understand how sex trafficking and sexual exploitation are happening in their community specific, and they will also understand that the perpetrators don't look one way, right? So if we have a case, it doesn't mean that case didn't happen in the way that it did, right? You look at some of the cases in Ramsey County and Hennepin County, and yes, there are certain players, right? But you're not always going to have the African-American pimp. You're not always going to have the victims who are white. And if we're only looking for that story, and if we're only reusing that story over and over and over again in our narratives, that's all we're going to be looking for in our communities. So the goal is to really make sure that our response is local, and it starts with the narratives that we are using, and acknowledging that perpetrators are coming from all walks of life. And I will just refer you all back to the Minnesota Nice Guys case if you have any doubts about that. And for those of you who have not heard of that case, I encourage you to Google it. It's quite fascinating. So in any case, let's talk about what sex trafficking and sexual exploitation actually are. How are we defining this in the law? And for those of you who, I don't know if we had enough copies of handouts, but if you need a handout, my contact information will be at the end of this presentation, and you can feel free to email me and I will send those to you. First of all, sex trafficking under Minnesota law is we've got it grouped it into two categories. The first is receiving, recruiting, enticing, harboring, providing, or obtaining by any means a person for the purposes of prostitution, or profiting off of that, knowing that it came from prostitution. And so the important thing here is that we do not have a forced fraud or coercion element. This is something that we have to keep hammering home as professionals, as community members. Our law does not require a showing of forced fraud or coercion. And in fact, in this most recent case where the inmate was running an operation, and this was not the only woman, this was just the case that the investigator was consulting us about, he actually had, I think it was 7 or 8 that he was running from inside. When they brought this information to the county attorney, the response was surprise. And she said, well, you know that this is sex trafficking under Minnesota law. Now granted, this county attorney was working on civil commitment issues, not necessarily criminal law issues, but it's really important that we know as a system and as professionals, that there's a difference between how we as a state are defining sex trafficking and how the federal law is defining sex trafficking. By any means, recognize this. Our legislature recognized, right, as we passed the law, we changed the law, that recognized that sex trafficking can happen in a lot of different ways. And this is where you get into the fact that if there's by any means, right, you don't require that showing of force, fraud, or coercion, consent isn't a defense. And prior involvement in prostitution isn't a defense. And that's kind of a big deal because, you know, at some point down the road, violence might be used, threats might be used, force, fraud, or coercion might be used, but typically it doesn't always start that way. And we have to recognize that because these individuals who have been subjected to this are victims too, and they're not perfect, and they don't necessarily have the most compelling story, and we can't just look for that compelling story or fail to recognize that this is just as compelling, right? That taking advantage of her vulnerabilities should be just as compelling as some of the other issues, because what we need to do is focus on the actions of the exploiter, not necessarily on the worthiness of the victim. We've already said a victim is a victim under Minnesota law. And there's the advocacy side of me coming out, right? So again, this is just kind of summarizes what the significance is to our law. And also when we'll talk a little bit later about our sort of progression in the statutes changing the law, but we did recognize that there is a harm in buying. And there's an ongoing conversation about the demand and those who are buying and driving the market. And so that's something that you should keep on your radars because we might have more developments coming out around that. Okay, so that is the sex trafficking statute and definition, but let's talk about sexual exploitation. First, we have to recognize that for safe harbor, when we're talking about sexually exploited youth, we're really talking about an issue that revealed this sort of conflict in our laws, right? So we know that prostitution is illegal. You get a kid engaging in something that's illegal, that's a delinquent act, so they go through the juvenile delinquency system. But then at the same time, if somebody was to solicit a minor or traffic a minor, that's a felony. So that youth is at the same time a victim of a crime that would be considered a felony, but also they are considered engaging in a delinquent act. That doesn't make sense. Right? We can't have them being a victim and also a perpetrator at the same time. And that also sort of points to what we know of kids, of youth, even up to the age of 24. Making those decisions, those life decisions, I mean, you can talk about consent all you want. When there's an added element of that commercial value, something in exchange for that sex act, you're talking about decision making in an exchange that doesn't, a youth, when their brain is not fully developed, I mean, this is not just advocacy, this is science, they're not capable of understanding the consequences. And so it's on the exploiter, on the buyer. And so that's what we did. We ended up changing our law. And here's just a little example of why we needed the safe harbor law. Historically and traditionally, it was true. I think there's some numbers out from 2005 of a study that was done that showed that between 90 to 95% of the arrests that were made were those who were engaging in prostitution, right? Who were and we can't know if they were being sold by a third party or not, but they were being purchased, right? Were a small percentage, that 5% or so. Those were the individuals that were being arrested who were buying, right? So largely our approach has been, let's arrest all the individuals engaging in prostitution, and that will take care of our prostitution problem. Instead of kind of understanding that there wouldn't be a prostitution problem unless there weren't folks willing to buy. And so now our shift as a state has recognized demand as an issue. And really, I mean, if you're talking about a kid on the street, are you going to arrest the kid for that? Or are you going to arrest the adult who knows full well what they're doing and has different levels of culpability depending on, you know, their relationship to the victim, depending on their social status and what they are offering in exchange for that sex act. And so there's this recognition that the adult should be culpable. So the definition that we are using, this is one that's coming out of the Department of Health. When we're talking about sexual exploitation and regarding youth specifically, we are talking about an exchange of anything of value or a promise of that exchange, right? A promise of anything of value for a sex act. And that's that commercialized sex act. So that means we're not just talking money, we're not just talking drugs. It could be things, and again, this is the type of thing that we are seeing in out-of-state as well as in the metro area, the survival sex. How many of you have heard the term survival sex before? Okay, some of you. Anybody who raised your hand, can you give your understanding of it, your definition? Hate to put you on the spot.
Someone who gets involved in prostitution or sexual exploitation in order to have food to live, place to live, place to survive.
Excellent. So somebody who's involved in prostitution or some form of sexual exploitation in order to have food, right, or something to survive. So let's just let that sink in for a bit. When we're talking about sexual exploitation, we are not talking about manipulative children that want to get money off of adults. We're talking about kids who just want food. And how many of us have had to do that for food, or for a place to stay, or for survival? So think about that in terms of yourself as adults. Now think about kids. And I'm using the term kids very loosely because we're in the room of adults, but when you're working with these youth, we're not going to call them a kid. Because they've been in very adult situations, we have to acknowledge that. But for the purposes of this training, we have to really recognize that we are talking about kids. And so that survival sex is a form of exploitation. And here's what is very interesting about our definition that we're using under Safe Harbor, under No Wrong Door. We are saying that a third party may or may not be involved. So again, this is something that is important for us as system professionals to recognize, to be able to articulate to the folks that we work with and other systems partners. I mean, we've had reports of a cop saying, yeah, that's not really. But actually it is under the law, right? It's not just this troubled youth who's couch hopping, who's manipulating older adult men in the community. As law enforcement, the law says, right, here is where this is sexual exploitation and a sexually exploited youth, and we'll take a look too under the child protection codes. A sexually exploited youth is considered a child in need of protection. So there should be some sort of action, right? And so how do we communicate that to our partners? When, as a state, we've been operating in one way, we've been understanding this issue in one way, and a law change, we're asking folks to operate in another way. And it's not just how do they uphold the law in their profession, it's how do they even think about this issue. And that's really hard to explain. This is not an easy topic because it's asking us to change the way we think about something that's also a cultural issue and a societal issue, and not to get too touchy-feely because I know I'm talking to a room full of lawyers, but we have to acknowledge the human aspect of it. It takes a lot to convince law enforcement from the top down, this is not only what the law is, but you actually have to do your job under the law. That's really hard when they've been operating a certain way, they think a certain way. And it's the same goes for advocacy too, right? Sometimes in this field we have a hierarchy of what's worse and who's been victimized the worst. And we still have to recognize that under law somebody has been victimized by this. And instead of focusing on whether or not they look like the right victim or the right kind of victim, we have to look at the acts of the exploiters. So, how did we go about completely changing our approach to sex trafficking and sexual exploitation? I won't get into too much detail.
There's a question from,
Oh.
would you like to take
Yeah,
the question now?
absolutely.
The question is, the presenter acknowledged that demand is the issue. In what way is this demand being combated?
Yeah, that's a great question. So did everybody hear in what way is demand being combated? And there's lots of different ways. I think the first way, which is not the only way, but the first most obvious way that we are taking a look at demand is changing how we do enforcement of prostitution. So a lot of times we're looking at prostitution stings, but instead of doing the Jane stings, we're doing the John stings. And I hate calling them John stings because I work with a lot of good Johns. People named John, and my brother-in-law is named John. So the buyers, right? And so that's where you do an operation and you've got an undercover posing as somebody who's offering commercialized sex, and then you arrest those guys. We also, we can get into this a little bit later too, we are looking at, it's 609.592, I believe. You can do these operations for individuals soliciting youth, and there can be an undercover officer. How many of you know Sergeant Grant Snyder with MPD? If you ever get a chance to talk with him, please do. He's fantastic. When I was actually doing direct services, he was the cop that I trusted, that I went to when I had a client that needed to talk with law enforcement, or whenever we had a particularly difficult case. So he has run some sting operations, Operation Guardian Angel being one of them, where you basically got this undercover officer posing as a youth, and he told me about a case where he went into the room, met a guy who had a video camera and all sorts of types of bondage ready and waiting for a 14, 15-year-old. So they're coming from our community, but that's a teeny tiny piece, because there's no way law enforcement in every community can devote the amount of time and resources they need to go after demand that's coming from their jurisdiction and surrounding jurisdictions. It's a way to convince your community that there is a demand issue. You post an ad and see how many responses you get, and you can report back to your community that this is happening. In Albert, we did this. There's a number of places that have done this, and it was kind of an eye-opening experience. But the point is, demand is at this end of the spectrum. How do we stop them from becoming demand? And you are hearing cases, all sorts of cases about sexual violence that occurs in colleges and universities, sexual violence that occurs in high schools. Feeling that you can purchase a person is a form of sexual violence. And yes, I'm owning that this is an advocacy perspective, but I gave you forewarning about that. But how do we then, as a community and as systems, start addressing it on the front end and challenging the way we are talking to young men and youth about healthy relationships, healthy sexuality? And that is not as exciting as a sting operation, but that is one way the anti-sexual violence movement and prevention movement, Department of Health, are sort of trying to target that demand focus. So to answer the question, there's stuff that you can do on the back end, but really what we want to push and prioritize is the stuff on the front end to combat demand. So kind of to take us through what has happened, and you can read through this in your notes, but basically it's been a progression as a state. We kind of realized that this was an issue. We did a sex trafficking needs assessment. That was the Advocates for Human Rights that kind of opened our eyes to the fact that this is happening in the state, and how it's happening and what some of the needs gaps are. We changed our law, so now we have sex trafficking on the books. And then we started looking at that safe harbor issue. And then the safe harbor issue, we realized, okay, there can be a law change, but how is this going to play out on the ground in real life? And I think that's someplace that we as professionals need to be very aware of. You can change something in the law on the books, but does it really work? Is it really working? And this is where we have to be really connected to the folks that are coming across our paths as practitioners, whether you are clicking and you've got somebody coming through an actual case and you're seeing this play out, whether it's you are volunteering in an advocacy organization or hearing from advocates. This law actually works or doesn't work, and this is why we're not seeing it being effective. And so as a state, we sort of said, we need a law change. Before it goes into effect, we need a plan to make it work. And that was our no wrongdoor services model, which we'll talk about soon. And then how do we fund that? Because it's great to have this law change. It's great to say this is how we as a state are going to deliver services to victims, but you got to show me the money. Right? You have to make sure that we are funding this issue, and slowly but surely, it's hard to ask for money from the state, but we've been getting funding. An issue like this is never fully funded, but we're hoping this session, the Family Partnership, Jeff Bauer is going to be advocating for the rest of that funding. So then there's this funding piece, there's this training piece, and then, okay, how do we, that's this bird's eye view from the statewide approach. How do we actually make it play out and make it work on the ground? And that's where MNCASA has come in with our protocol guidelines, which we'll talk about, and protocol development. And the P word, protocol, is very, very scary to some folks because they think it sounds really technical. They think it binds you in. You have to follow these protocols exactly in your work, or the case is blown if there's a misstep. And so those are valid concerns, but protocol is really just a plan on paper that a community is going to use to say this is how law enforcement is going to interact with advocacy, the education system, the healthcare system, in order to make sure that when we identify a sexually exploited youth, they are getting the services that they need and the services that we promise to provide them under no wrongdoor. So what have we done so far? Passed the law. We've got the no wrong door services model. And this is something that I mentioned it earlier. The no wrong door services model, because it's coming out of a public health approach, we are not just looking at this as a criminal justice issue. Yes, criminal justice, the criminal justice system will get involved. It could either be through the juvenile justice system because, you've got a youth who's truant and then they're identified by their probation officer as also being sexually exploited, or those traditional cases where a victim is going through the criminal justice system as a witness or a named victim in the case. But a lot of times this stuff is happening in other systems. You are going to get kids who are sexually exploited but never, ever, ever go through a criminal case. And we know this already about sexual assault cases and even domestic violence cases. There's not a lot that reaches that triangle, right, of being actually reported and then actually investigated and then actually charged with a conviction. And that's the same for cases of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. And so the goal is to be more comprehensive and make sure that if we're actually serious about serving these victims and coming up with a statewide system, it's got to be more than just criminal justice focus. Yes, we need to train law enforcement, but we basically have to train everybody else who also has contact with youth. And that's pretty much all of us, right? Even if it's not in our professional lives, it might happen in our personal lives because you got a brother or a sister, you got a daughter or a daughter's friend, volunteer, PTA. I'm not at that point yet, but there's that contact with youth, right? And in addition to that, there are some, let me make sure I get this all out, values. And these values that were written into our state plan under No Wrong Door. And No Wrong Door basically says that wherever a sexually identified youth is identified, whether they're identified through a guidance counselor at school, a clinic nurse, when they're getting contraception, an advocacy agency, a youth services, a homeless shelter, youth serving agency, wherever they're identified, they are not going to be going through the juvenile justice system. They are going to be given access to the services and housing they need. So at any entry point, it's going to be the right door. That's the theory behind No Wrong Door. And again, how do you actually make that work and play out in every community? Because every community is so different. You do that by adopting a set of values. You start by adopting a set of values. Because if everybody is on the same page about how our work is going to be done, then you can get somewhere. Then you can navigate through some of the harder points of conflict or tension, like, all right, our community doesn't have a homeless youth shelter, but we have juvenile detention, and what do we do when we pick up a youth? Where do they stay? Right? Do we use detention? Do we not use detention? There's all sorts of ramifications when you do use detention. But that conversation can't happen in a productive and effective way. And by effective, I mean effectively victim-centered, unless you are agreeing that these values are something that you're going to agree to abide by, right? So there are 9 total. And the last one, I would be remiss if I didn't mention, is that we are talking about sexual exploitation as something that can be prevented, right? And that gets us thinking, again, holistically, instead of reactionary. When we have a case of sexual exploitation, what do we do about it? How do we start building a community where we are focusing on prevention? That's just as important, not as exciting, doesn't make the news, but it's just as important. And when you hear directly from youth who have been sexually exploited, probably more important, right? They would rather not have gone through that in order to get services. They would have rather been provided with opportunities and safeguards at the front end, so this never would have happened to them, right? So I encourage you to look those over and really try and think about how that is going to apply to you and to the system that you are operating in. So we talked about safe harbor, we talked about No Wrong Door, the values, and then we had to train folks on it. And that's been a challenge. There's been different initiatives to train systems professionals and community members on what the law is and what the underlying values are and what we have said we're going to do as a state. It is impossible to train everybody. right? I mean, this is a decent turnout in this room and a decent turnout online, but are we getting everybody in every single system? No. And so you are going to run into situations where maybe you've got a couple of guys who've attended an investigator training, but the rest of the staff have not. And so if you get a patrol officer that encounters a sexually exploited youth and they've never been trained and can't identify, what happens? And I will tell you what happens. We've had a situation in a community where a youth she's in a group home in placement. So again, we're talking about systems that aren't necessarily involved in the criminal justice system. She's in different groups homes and has made the rounds because her pimp keeps picking her up. And so she wants to get in trouble so she can move. And she finally just decides that the only way that she can get a safe place to stay is to get in trouble so she can go to detention, right? Go to the juvenile justice center. And so she's tried to reveal, right? She's tried to talk to patrol officers. She tried to talk to her county social worker. This is happening to me. But she was dismissed. And I will say again, we have to remember this. She was in a community that was predominantly white. She was a girl of color. And there were a lot of assumptions being made about who she was and whether or not she was telling the truth. And to me, that boggles my mind because she was willing to give information about her pimp and the house that he had, that he was operating from, but nobody was listening to her, and they were ignoring her. And so she finally did threaten to set a group home on fire, and law enforcement came in, and they did a strip search, and that triggered her. Because of course it would trigger her after you've been through what you've been through, you've been sexually exploited. When you have a female officer conducting that kind of a search in front of two male officers, that would make you react. And so her trauma reaction, right, what was the result of trauma, landed her with 7 felony charges. And even then, we're talking about an area that's been trained, all the different systems has been trained. They have a regional navigator. And I should back up too. When I say regional navigators, does everybody know what I'm talking about? Some yeses and some no's, so I will quickly explain. Basically what we've done as part of No Wrong Door has divided Minnesota up into 10 regions, 9 regions, and then 2 tribal. And each region of Minnesota has a point of contact called the regional navigator. That regional navigator is the person that is a subject matter expert, as well as somebody who is connected in their communities, in the regions in their communities, knows who to call, right? So if you've got a call coming in saying we maybe have a sexually exploited youth or we don't know, can you check? They can do an assessment, but they can also connect whoever's calling them, whether it's law enforcement or school or medical, connect them with services. So you need that point of contact, you need that expert to be able to sort of make that No Wrong Door work. It's still an impossible job because how do you divide an entire state up into only 9 regions and cover a huge region, particularly in greater Minnesota when the regions are huge. That's really hard to do, but that's part of No Wrong Door, and if you want to know more about that, I encourage you to look at the Minnesota Department of Health website. So in any case, this particular region had a lot of trainings that was done by the regional navigator. Even going into court, there was suspicion about trying to get the youth placement in a safe harbor state-funded housing and services agency because the prosecutor didn't know. I didn't know anything about that. I'm not sending a kid to anything like that. So to me, in my mind, I'm thinking, you got prosecution, you got county social workers, you've got law enforcement. They just didn't know. Even when you put aside some of the racial biases, which really we shouldn't do because that is coming into play a lot. When you look solely at the system, right, what does it take to train top down? All the investigators, all of the county social workers, educate the judiciary. What does it take so that that youth didn't have to go through that process? So that on the front end, when she tried confiding in a patrol officer or her social worker, even when she got arrested, so that the arrest was conducted in a certain way. Then when she went before a judge, what would have happened if the judge knew about this and knew about the prosecutor knew about the fact that there's state money funding specific shelters and group homes for victims of sexual exploitation? How would that have gone down? It would have been much different, I think. And so the logistics of that is why we need protocol. So really, we know what happens. That we have no wrong door, but we know that there are consequences to having a wrong door, right? Just in that story alone, the way this plays out. I'm sure you can imagine a lot of other consequences of what happens when we really are, and by we I mean different systems, we are a wrong door, because we can. It's a great idea, it's a great theory, it's a great framework, but we have to actually do the work to become a state full of no wrong doors, right? So the reason we need protocol is to sort of bridge that gap, right? Where we've done all this work changing the law, we've done all this work setting up a framework, we've done all this work trying to train folks. But how do we actually help communities develop their local response? Of how are we gonna, what is gonna be our first step once we identify sexually exploited youth? How do we work internally to make sure everybody is trained that comes in? There's gonna be consistent, regular training. So that when somebody retires or decides Minnesota's too cold for them and switches departments and goes to Florida, like my parents, they will still continue to follow the same procedures and processes to ensure that a youth has been, who has been sexually exploited receives those services, right? And so that's protocol. So it's about the local response, and I'm going to put emphasis here on local. Because again, the way sex trafficking and sexual exploitation happens is different. It's different. Do you have gang-related, do you have, pimp-controlled, whether it's guerrilla pimp or lover boy sort of operations? Yes. Do they happen? Yes. Do they happen in the metro area? Yes. Sometimes they will. You'll have groups that are traveling, and so it will touch greater Minnesota as well as other states. But how else is it happening? Okay? Do you have Minnesota Nice Guys, Assistant Hennepin County Attorney, connecting victims out of his basement with wealthy buyers? Yes, we do in Minnesota. Do we have teachers? There was a case in North Dakota where there was a teacher. And it's not to, this isn't to sensationalize the issue. This is to really get us to start telling different narratives around what is actually happening, right? I mean, if you've got a community where this is happening, where you've got the kid at school selling his girlfriend to his friends, that's a serious community issue that you've got to deal with. And you feel safe because it's not a big bad pimp coming in, targeting your girls. And it's safer to be able to say that's what that is and that happens out there, right? No, you have to take into consideration what is happening in your local community, and also coming back to demand, you have to be willing to ask the question, do we have demand coming from our community? Oh, that's really tricky, right? Because traditionally we didn't arrest them, and we didn't look at it as bad as selling a person. But now this is the conversation we're having. We're acknowledging the harm that is done, and we're treating it as something that is worthy, especially when it comes to youth. I mean, that's a felony if you solicit a minor. So what does it look like? It has to be local in your community. And then it has to be on the ground, right? Working with the systems in your community. So the legislature gave money to actually start developing protocol, developing the local response. And initially the idea was we are going to build a statewide model protocol. And this was money that was given to Ramsey County Attorney's Office to develop a model protocol. And you've seen other states doing this, and it sounds like a great idea. There is no such thing as a statewide model protocol. You cannot have a model that meets the needs of every community. It just won't. And I know I'm kind of getting up here a little bit, but really start thinking about on the ground. If you're seeing sex trafficking happening the way I described it in high schools, right? But your protocol, or the model protocol, is built around gang-related, where law enforcement are only looking at, for example, people who are in gangs, right? That statement of, well, that doesn't happen here, you're going to hear that a lot because this isn't happening here. And so how do you, as a community, local, and as systems who are going to be involved in this, take a look at and ask the question, how is this happening here? You actually have to get on the ground and start talking to folks. And sometimes it's folks that you interact with a little bit, and sometimes it's folks that you only interact with in certain situations, but that means you actually have to have people talking to each other. Once they're talking to each other, there are no changes, and we all know this too. Nothing changes unless you get the decision makers up here making changes, right? And so if you've got a law enforcement agency that's like, great, we are going to train everybody that comes in, we're going to do regular roll call videos, and not only are we going to train them on what sex trafficking and sexual exploitation are, we're going to get local experts to come talk, and maybe there will be somebody who works directly with victims who will come and talk about how this is happening on the ground. So great, now we got everybody trained. And they're all looking for the signs, and they all know what to do when they've got somebody who could possibly be a sexually exploited youth. So that's one agency. The work that it takes to do that, the internal procedures, you got to write that into your employee handbook. You got to actually develop the relationships with the local experts to do the trainings. You've got to have the time and resources to be able to let somebody, off their shift or before they start their shift do a training. That's just one agency. What does it look like if we're talking about all the schools and within a particular district? How we are going to, this is what we're going to institute for our teachers and for the administrators and counselors and nurses, right? And then start talking about how we as an agency are going to work with another agency. And that gets pretty dicey too. And that's where you get that term MOU, that Memorandum of Understanding, which is, it kind of acts like, I don't want to say the word contract, because again, people are going to pick that apart, all of you lawyers. But it's an agreement, right, between two agencies of how we are going to interact with each other. And you have to recognize that, okay, advocacy is bound by different restrictions around confidentiality, and we cannot talk about certain things unless we get a written release from the victim. That doesn't mean we're withholding information. We're not trying to obstruct an investigation, if there is an investigation. But how do you then get agencies to understand what their different roles are? That has to be done through talking, through getting together and actually coming together as a multidisciplinary team or group. So,
another question if you
yeah,
want. Okay.
yeah.
It's what about educating children themselves? And she gives the example, last summer my 5-year-old daughter was offered sex for money from slightly older boys at her daycare. Grand theft auto was apparently a factor. I don't think we can rely on parents to properly educate their kids, particularly their boys, on how to treat girls and women with respect, especially after the recent presidential election. I personally believe these issues need to be a part of an ongoing health curriculum, starting with kindergarten.
Mm-hmm. So that was a fantastic observation, comment, and question. So for those of you, I'll try and summarize. Basically, we had a 5-year-old who was offered money in exchange for sex at a daycare, right, by some older boys. And there's mention of grand theft auto, and so that hits on a few things, right? It hits on the cultural aspect and what we were talking before about, that this is something that can be prevented. I'm not shocked. I think I've heard enough by now that it may not have been a serious transaction, but think about when kids are actually playing around in that way. What do we know? What's our normal reaction? Oh, they're just being kids. They're not serious. What happens after you add a few more years to that? And this sort of attitude hasn't been addressed, right? And so the comment at the end was that this needs to be part of an ongoing health curriculum. Here's the thing. I even in direct service, and I cringe to think about this. And I know I did a co-presentation with a colleague and a survivor, and afterwards we were talking about how basically the format, the direction the conversation went with a high school class, it was almost as if there was a particular kid asking certain questions to gain instruction on how to do it, right? So I want to be clear too, when we're talking to kids, yeah, we should be talking to kids about this. But it shouldn't just be isolated, this is what sex trafficking is, and this is how you avoid it, and don't do it, and because we're not giving them the full context. We're not giving them what they need to know. It's not just something that this is how you can prevent yourself from being a victim, or a way that you can prevent yourself from being a victim, and it's not just about boys growing up to treat women with respect, even though that is a huge part of it. We're talking about very basic foundational things that we've sort of, for a lot of reasons, political reasons included, kept out of the school, out of the conversations that we have at school. And kids are getting their education and having these conversations because we're not doing it in the school context with guidance and a lot of structure and with research and good information, right? They're getting it elsewhere. We know they're getting it elsewhere from their peers, from online, from culture. And so how do we then as a state prioritize that education? That is another systems question, right? Because I mean, you look at some of the conversations we have around comprehensive sex ed in the state. There have been many attempts to try and get that into our schools. Kids aren't just going to be learning about sexual exploitation, they need to be learning about healthy sexuality. And that's not just the experts saying that. For those of you who haven't heard of this document, I would encourage you to look it up. It's the Hennepin County No Wrong Door Initiative, Voices of Safe Harbor. Even if you Google Voices of Safe Harbor, you'll probably get this document up. This was a collection of focus groups and interviews with survivors who gave their feedback on their experiences and basically them educating us as systems professionals and as communities on what they need from us and what they would have needed on the front end. And part of that is relationship stuff. So kids, it's not, my point is let's not just focus on here's what sex trafficking is, because sometimes that's a sensationalized story and they like to tell, but it's so far removed from their reality. But you better believe that conversation about the coach calling, come on, you ladies, come on, in other terms, to encourage the boys to run faster, that is part of their culture. That's part of their reality. And so how do you get kids to start looking at things like that and engage in critical thinking? You're not going to do that by just talking about sex trafficking. So the point is to build in the youth, before they become adults. And oh man, one part of my job too in direct service was helping to facilitate the John School, which was for first-time prostitution offenders for the buyers. This was a sentencing option where they would go, instead of jail time, they would go to an all-day class and hear from all sorts of experts and community leaders and survivors. But man, when you get that 18-year-old high school student coming in there, you're used to the businessmen and you're used to the professionals, but the 18-year-old kid, you just shake your head and go, what made you think that this was okay? And it's because that's the way we've conditioned kids. We've conditioned girls to see their value in a certain way. We've conditioned boys to see this is what masculinity is, this is what makes you a man, this is what you're allowed to do and entitled to do. We've conditioned folks to think that this is a male-female thing where the victims are all female and the perpetrators are all male. I will say by and large perpetrators tend to be male, but victims are of all genders. We've got male, female, transgender, and that also has to be a part of our narrative that we're using when we're talking to our colleagues, when we are educating those around us, when we were doing trainings. We don't want to leave folks out, but that's probably a long answer to the comment and question that was raised previously, but absolutely yes, we should be educating our kids, but I would just encourage folks to promote a comprehensive piece of education, because the Voices of Safe Harbor document, some of the most profound comments in there were, I didn't know what a healthy relationship was, so I didn't know that what I was involved in was abusive. So for those of us here who are sitting kind of from a position of privilege, and I don't know where everybody's at in the room, but I know I'm privileged for a lot of reasons, but one of them is also the fact that I didn't grow up in abuse. And that I didn't have abusive relationships, but furthermore, I had a therapist for a mom. And so we really quickly identified what was healthy and what was not healthy in relationships. And so I was able to spot that, and that's not something that everybody gets. Clearly it's not, both because of how they are allowing themselves to be treated and how they're treating others. And so this really needs to be part of the conversation. So I'm going to bring it back to how we are addressing this in communities. And this is a point too, right? You have to have this conversation in your community. You have to get your school administrators and the school district on board with allowing that type of education in your schools. It's a touchy subject, right? Nobody wants to talk about sex in schools. And certainly don't want to bring in the word prostitution. And you don't necessarily have to do it that way. There are ways to accommodate the culture and practices of a community and still reach your goal of educating youth about what healthy relationships are. But but that has to happen in your local community. So we don't have a statewide model protocol, but what we did create were a set of guidelines, very comprehensive document that's coming out at the end of this month called the Safe Harbor Protocol Guidelines. You'll find that on the MnCASA website coming soon. And so the goal is, let's create some tools that the entire state can use and adapt and modify and build their own local response. And so that's going to be part of it. So the guidelines will have some very foundational chapters, especially for communities that this is the first time they've even started talking about this issue, right? Because it's been so far removed, and the way we talk about it, it is far removed. That is not the way it's happening here. So it's hard to really say, we need to prioritize this as something that we're going to take care of. So some of it will be these foundational chapters so you can introduce this topic to folks. Particularly folks who are more resistant to acknowledging that this happens in their community. And then there's going to be discipline-specific chapters where you're getting into all the systems that could possibly touch this issue, and then next steps. And that's the project that I'm coordinating now is, okay, now we have the information, we have the law change, we have the framework, we've gotten some training, how do we actually build our response? And that's going to be sort of two things simultaneously and both informing each other. We've got the tools and resources, including the guidelines and other tools and resources that we have developed as an organization in doing our state and national work around multidisciplinary teaming and building that response. But at the same time, we've identified teams in each of the no wrong door regions and are working with select teams and not only providing support, but really learning from them. This is a learning process. And all of this as a state, we're doing a lot of great work. We are still learning. And so I don't in any way want to convey that we've got it all covered and that we have the solution. This is still new, and we are still building this, and it's an exciting time, and all of you are a part of it, but we have to do this learning, and when we learn, this would have been a practical tool, or this is something to avoid, we put that into a statewide tool that then becomes available to other communities across the state. So it's kind of, it's happening simultaneously and informing each other. So you've heard me say systems response, you've heard me use this term a lot, and that's because I'm distinguishing it from community members or even ourselves as professionals in our capacity as community members. When I refer to the systems response, we're talking about agencies and institutions, governmental or community-based, but whole institutions, right, kind of coordinating together and building that response. It's not necessarily just the on-the-ground coordination, me as an advocate calling Grant Snyder when I have an issue come up. That's not an agency relationship. That was an individual. I knew I could trust this guy. And I know I'm talking a lot about the relationship between law enforcement and advocacy and bringing up those examples a lot. That's because historically there's just been a lot of tension, and it's okay to acknowledge that. And I think we lose credibility when we don't talk about it. But it's also important to know that those relationships, those personal relationships, are important, but it's more important to have institutionalized relationships. And so that's part of this systems response, is getting the institutions or agencies themselves connecting and talking to one another so that decisions that get made or things that happen on the ground, it's not just a one-time deal, that this is going to become a consistent practice for the agency. And it's not the exciting work, right? People want to do that active case management. They want to talk about actual cases. But I will tell you, it's so stressful when you're dealing with those active cases and you don't know what your next steps are or who to call. So yes, that's the real stuff that's happening on the ground. But boy, wouldn't it have been nice to know exactly from law enforcement or from the healthcare system who I should have called, who's the point of contact, and what are the next steps. That, as somebody who works directly with victims, would have been really helpful. So that is what protocol does, is sets that system up that meets the specific needs of the community, that takes into consideration their resources, their culture, their practices, their existing relationships, their reality. Okay? So these are the different systems. And probably you can look at the systems and find yourself in that spot. You may not be the decision maker in your particular system, but you probably talk to decision makers. And so how do you, in your professional personal capacity, start introducing the subject and introducing the educating, right? Not in a condescending way, but just as we all need to be on the same page about this way. So I know we're running close to time, but I just want to encourage you to think about what your response is, what your role is in the system's response, and just really think about that. I'm going to distinguish between our roles as professionals and our roles as community members, because you're going to get this a lot. There's a lot of communities that want to start a task force or do these awareness events, and they want to engage community members, and that is great. They are an untapped resource. There are ways to do it that can be really effective and really lend to that local system's response. But we do need to distinguish. Community members, even if we're talking about city council, they're not going to be doing active case management, which needs to happen. They're also probably not going to be doing that developing of the protocol necessarily. But they still have this role. And their role is critical because that is how you get buy-in from your leaders. That's where you get the funding support. Their role is going to be community outreach and awareness. And again, think about your role as a professional and as a community member, right? What is your role in the system's response, and how can you influence the community response? So this is what we have said that community members can do. And so when you do talk to folks in your regions and areas, really encourage them to read Voices of Safe Harbor, but also understand their role in this response. They don't need to be a part of the exciting sting operations. They're not going to be knocking on the door of a neighbor who they think is a pimp. But what are they going to be doing? And how can we effectively use them? And again, the Voices of Safe Harbor document point to things that community members can and should be doing. And so I'll just encourage you to do that in your local areas, is really engage them in the most effective way. So I am more than happy to take questions now. I know we're getting close to time. Yeah, so it's up to you. If otherwise, you can contact me. My contact information is on the screen and in your handouts, and so feel free and email me or call me.
There are two questions here if you want them. I don't know if you want to take
Sure.
them from the audience first.
Sure.
One is, have faith-based communities been helpful?
Okay, this is an excellent question. Have faith-based communities been helpful? And full disclosure, totally not a part of my Min-Casa job. I am from those communities. And I will say that in some cases they have, and in some cases they haven't. And that is because historically and traditionally in this field, I think there's been sort of a separation or divide because there are ideological differences between the work of the anti-sexual violence movement, public health, whatever the movement is, whatever the sector is, and faith communities. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a role to play. It doesn't mean that in particular communities, victims are coming from those communities. Victims rely on faith communities for their healing. And also that's a great way to access youth, again, on the front end, because how many of the guys in the John School came from churches? A lot. I'll say that. So there is a role to play. I think the key is engaging faith communities in a way that is effective, right? And you're not going to know that unless you're in that community talking on the ground. So there's a trafficking justice movement, trafficking justice initiative that it's a kind of a consortium of faith communities that are doing some work. One example that they've done is provide funding to an advocacy agency so that women who are unable to get into shelter can get into have hotel rooms, especially in winter, right? That's particularly important, right? You need a place to stay. In some cases, there are groups that are doing, they're funding an advocacy agency to do a shelter, so they're paying for the shelter. You're going to have all sorts of community members in the faith community, lawyers, doctors. So what can they do? What kind of services can they do and can they offer? What can they do to advocate for policy? What can they do to advocate for comprehensive sex ed in schools? For the type of education that works for their culture and practice in the community, right? So I think traditionally, my point is that we have to engage all community members, including the faith community. It hasn't always been done in the best way, and it can be done in a better way. And if we leave them out, I will be frank, if we do not educate the faith community the way we are engaging and educating other systems and system professionals, then the end result is more harm than good. even if it's unintentional harm. One example was, I remember my mother writing me saying, I saw a promotional video about a team that went overseas to help sex trafficking victims, and the pastor was sitting there with girls on his lap. Right? So all of us are like, what are you doing? That's, re-traumatizing, re-victimizing the dynamics of that relationship. Obviously, he's not intentionally trying to exploit that young girl. Is not understanding that as a white man going into a foreign country, and he is the primary customer base, right? He represents that customer base. Sitting on the lap is very harmful. We don't want people going out and doing that, right? We don't want people inadvertently causing more harm than good, and if we don't want that to happen, then we have to engage and we have to educate. We also have to stay in our lane, and so that is going to be local and community specific. So that's probably a long roundabout answer, but hopefully that provided some decent information for the questioner. Yeah. Any questions from the group? I know it's time to have.
We were talking about in the beginning the definitions of sex trafficking, sexual exploitation under Minnesota law. Did a brief comparison to federal law and other states. Could you elaborate a little bit further? How is this different than other states? Have you done surveys? Was that part of the research? And I just was it?
Oh no! So you're asking about the actual text of the sex trafficking statute?
Yeah, and you were just kind of distinguishing.
Yeah. And so I think if you take a look at most states, your straightforward sex trafficking law, and the federal law in particular, you're going to find for adults there's a requirement or showing of force, fraud, or coercion to be involved. For kids, you don't need that. In our state law, we are saying you don't need that whether you're an adult or a kid. And that's a good distinction to bring up too, is that under federal law, there's no requirement of force, fraud, or coercion if it's a kid. But in our state, where we think, you don't just stop being a victim once you turn 18, or you don't need to prove that element. So other states are very similar. We build our laws off of what the feds are saying too, especially if we haven't done this before. And so there's that force, fraud, or coercion element. Typically, the distinction is made with kids. Yeah, so hopefully that answers your question. Anybody else? I may have to head out. Okay, well I will be, thank you. Thank you for your time. I'll stay after if you guys have questions.